The Americans, Chapter 10, The Union in Peril, Section 4, Slavery and Secession. On June 16, 1858, the Republican Party of Illinois nominated its state chairman, Abraham Lincoln, to run for the U.S. Senate against Democrat incumbent Stephen A. Douglas. That night, Lincoln launched his campaign with a ringing address to the convention. It included a biblical quotation, a personal voice, Abraham Lincoln. "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." Lincoln was correct in that the United States could not survive for long with such a deep gulf between the North and the South. But was he right that the Union would not dissolve? With a weak president in James Buchanan and new legal questions over slavery, the United States faced the future with apprehension. Some suspected that events would lead to a trail of powder to a final explosion. Section 1. Slavery dominates politics. For strong leaders, slavery was a difficult issue, but it presented even more of a challenge for the indecisive President Buchanan, whose administration was plagued by slavery-related controversies. The first one arose on March 6, 1857. Dred Scott decision. In 1856, an important legal question came before the Supreme Court. The case concerned Dred Scott, a slave from Missouri. Scott's owner had taken him north of the Missouri Compromise line in 1834. For 4 years, they had lived in free territory in Illinois and Wisconsin. Later, they returned to Missouri, where Scott's owner died. Scott then began a lawsuit to gain his freedom. He claimed that he had become a free person by living in free territory for several years. On March 6, 1857, the Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney handed down the decision. See Dred Scott v. Sanford, page 332. The court ruled that slaves did not have the rights of citizens. Furthermore, said the court, Dred Scott had no claim to freedom because he had been living in Missouri, a slave state, when he began his suit. Finally, the court ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Congress could not forbid slavery in any part of the territories. Doing so would interfere with slaveholders' rights to own property, a right protected by the Fifth Amendment. Sectional passions exploded immediately. Southerners cheered the court's decision. Northerners were stunned. By striking down the Missouri Compromise, the Supreme Court had cleared the way for the expansion of slavery. Opponents of slavery now pinned their hopes on the Republican Party. If the Republicans became strong enough, they could keep slavery in check. The Lecompton Constitution. In the fall of 1857, the pro-slavery government at Lecompton, Kansas, wrote a constitution and applied for admission to the Union. Free Soilers, who by this time outnumbered pro-slavery settlers in Kansas by nearly 10-1, rejected the proposed constitution because it protected the rights of slaveholders. The legislature called for a referendum in which the people could vote on the pro-slavery constitution. They voted against it. At this point, President Buchanan made a poor decision. He endorsed the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. He owed his presidency to Southern support and believed that since Kansas contained only about 200 slaves, the Free Soilers were overreacting. Buchanan's endorsement provoked the wrath of Illinois Democrat Stephen A. Douglas, who did not care whether slavery is voted down or voted up. What he cared about was popular sovereignty. Backed by an anti-slavery coalition of Republicans and Northern Democrats, Douglas persuaded Congress to authorize another referendum on the Constitution. In summer 1858, voters rejected the Constitution once again. Northerners hailed Douglas as a hero, Southerners scorned him as a traitor, and the two wings of the Democratic Party moved still further apart. Section 2. Lincoln-Douglas Debates. That summer witnessed the start of one of Illinois' greatest political contests, the 1858 race for the U.S. Senate between Democratic incumbent Douglas and Republican challenger Abraham Lincoln. To many outsiders, it must have seemed like an uneven match. Douglas was a two-term senator with an outstanding record and a large campaign chest. Who was Lincoln? A self-educated man with a dry wit, Lincoln was known locally as a successful lawyer and politician. Elected as a Whig to one term in Congress in 1846, he broke with his party after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 and became a Republican 2 years later. Lincoln challenges Douglas. As the senatorial campaign progressed, the Republican Party decided that Lincoln needed to counteract the Little Giant's well-known name and extensive financial resources. As a result, Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of 7 open-air debates to be held throughout Illinois on the issue of slavery in the territories. Douglas accepted the challenge, and the stage was set for some of the most celebrated debates in U.S. history. Lincoln and Douglas had very different speaking styles. Douglas exuded self-confidence, pacing back and forth on the stage, dramatically using his fists to pound home his points. Lincoln, on the other hand, delivered his comments solemnly, using direct and plain language. Positions and arguments. The two men's positions were simple and consistent. Douglas believed deeply in popular sovereignty, in allowing the residents of a territory to vote for or against slavery. Although he did not think that slavery was immoral, he did believe that it was a backward labor system, unsuitable to prairie agriculture. The people, Douglas figured, understood this and would vote Kansas and Nebraska free. However, Lincoln, like many Free Soilers, believed that slavery was immoral and a labor system based on greed. The cruel difference between the two was that Douglas believed that popular sovereignty would allow slavery to pass away on its own, while Lincoln doubted that slavery would cease to spread without legislation outlawing it in the territories. In the course of the debates, each candidate tried to distort the views of the other. Lincoln tried to make Douglas look like a defender of slavery and of the Dred Scott decision. In turn, Douglas accused Lincoln of being an abolitionist and an advocate of racial equality. Lincoln responded by saying, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." He did, however, insist that slavery was a moral, social, and political wrong that should not be allowed to spread. The Freeport Doctrine. In their second debate, held in Freeport, Lincoln asked his opponent a crucial question. Could the settlers of the territory vote to exclude slavery before the territory became a state? Everyone knew that the Dred Scott decision said no, that territories could not exclude slavery. Popular sovereignty, Lincoln implied, was thus an empty phrase. Douglas's response to Lincoln's question became later known as the Freeport Doctrine. Douglas contended, "Slavery cannot exist a day or an hour anywhere unless it is supported by local police regulations." If the people of a territory were Free Soilers, he explained, then all they had to do was elect representatives who would not enforce slave property laws. In other words, regardless of theory or the Supreme Court's ruling, people could get around the Dred Scott decision. Douglas won the Senate seat, but his response had worsened the split between the northern and southern wings of the Democratic Party. As for Lincoln, His attacks on the vast moral evil of slavery drew national attention, and some Republicans began thinking of him as an excellent candidate for the presidency in 1860. Passions Ignite, Section 3. If 1858 was a year of talk, then 1859 turned out to be a year of action. Most Americans probably would have welcomed a respite from the issue of slavery. Instead, God's angry man, John Brown, reemerged on the scene and ended all hopes for a compromise over slavery between the North and the South. Harper's Ferry. While politicians debated the slavery issue, John Brown was studying the slave uprisings that had occurred in ancient Rome and on the French island of Haiti. He believed that the time was ripe for a similar uprising in the United States. Brown secretly obtained financial backing from several prominent Northern abolitionists. On the night of October 16, 1859, he led a band of 21 men, black and white, into Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. His aim was to seize the federal arsenal there, distribute the captured arms to slaves in the area, and start a general slave uprising. 60 of the town's prominent citizens were held hostage by Brown, who hoped that their slaves would then join the insurrection. No slaves came forward. Instead, local troops killed 8 of Brown's men. Then a detachment of U.S. Marines, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, raced to Harper's Ferry, stormed the engine house where Brown and his men had barricaded themselves, killed 2 more of the raiders, and captured Brown. Brown was then turned over to Virginia to be tried for treason. Historians have long debated Brown's actions. There is no doubt that he hated slavery with all his heart. However, why did he fail to tell slaves in the area about his plans beforehand? Why didn't he provide his men with enough food to last for even one day? In any case, Brown certainly hoped that his actions would arouse Northern fury and start a war for abolition. John Brown's hanging. On December 2, 1859, Brown was hanged for high treason in the presence of federal troops and a crowd of curious observers. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Although Lincoln and Douglas condemned Brown as a murderer, many other Northerners expressed admiration for him and for his cause. Bells tolled at the news of his execution, guns fired salutes, and huge crowds gathered to hear fiery speakers denounce the South. Some Northerners began to call Brown a martyr for the sacred cause of freedom. The response was equally extreme in the South, where outraged mobs assaulted whites who were suspected of holding anti-slavery views. Harper's Ferry terrified Southern slaveholders, who were convinced the North was plotting slave uprisings everywhere. Even longtime supporters of the Union called for secession. As one former Unionist explained, "I am willing to take the chances of disunion sooner than submit any longer to Northern insolence and Northern outrage." Section 4. Lincoln is elected president. Despite the tide of hostility that now flowed between the North and South, the Republican Party eagerly awaited its presidential convention in May 1860. When the convention began, almost everyone believed that the party's candidate would be Senator William H. Seward of New York. However, events took a dramatic turn. The Republican Convention. The convention took place in Chicago, which had quickly transformed itself into a convention city with more than 50 hotels and an 18,000 square foot wooden meeting center named the Wigwam. Republicans flooded into the frontier city in such crowds that despite the preparations, many ended up sleeping on pool tables in the hotels. The convention opened to a surging crowd of delegates, newsmen, and spectators. The 4,500-person delegate floor overflowed within minutes. To gain seating in the galleries, which were reserved for gentlemen who had come with ladies, determined single men even offered schoolgirls a quarter for their company. The first day of the convention was passed in forming committees, listening to prayers, and gossiping about politics. As events came to a close, campaign managers for the candidates retreated to their headquarters and began bargaining for delegates' votes, some working late into the night. Seward and Lincoln. Senator William H. Seward appeared to have everything one needed in order to be a successful presidential candidate: the credential of having led anti-slavery forces in Congress, the financial support of New York political organizations, and a desire to be the center of attention. In fact, Seward himself had little doubt that he would be nominated. Well before the voting took place, Seward drafted his senatorial resignation speech, which he planned to deliver when his nomination became official. Seward's well-known name and his reputation may have worked against him, however. Abraham Lincoln's being relatively unknown probably won him the nomination. Unlike Seward, Lincoln had not had much chance to offend his fellow Republicans. The delegates rejected Seward and his talk of an irrepressible conflict between North and South. On the third ballot, they nominated Lincoln, who seemed more moderate in his views. Although Lincoln pledged to halt the further spread of slavery, as with a chain of steel, he also tried to reassure Southerners that a Republican administration would not directly or indirectly interfere with their slaves or with them about their slaves. His reassurances fell on deaf ears. In Southerners' eyes, he was a black Republican whose election would be the grossest evil that has ever befallen this country. The election of 1860. 3 major candidates vied for office in addition to Lincoln. The Democratic Party split over the issue of slavery. Northern Democrats backed Stephen Douglas and his doctrine of popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats backed Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Former Know-Nothings and Whigs from the South, along with some moderate Northerners, organized the Constitutional Union Party, which ignored the issue of slavery altogether. They nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Lincoln emerged as the winner, but like Buchanan in the previous election, he received less than half of the popular vote. In fact, although Lincoln defeated his combined opponents in the electoral vote by 180 to 123, he received no electoral votes from the South. Unlike Buchanan, Lincoln had sectional rather than national support, carrying every free state, but not even appearing on the ballot in most of the slave states. The outlook for the Union was grim. Section 5. Southern Secession. Lincoln's victory convinced Southerners that they had lost their political voice in the national government. Fearful that Northern Republicans would submit the South to what noted Virginia agriculturalist Edmund Ruffin called the most complete subjugation and political bondage, some Southern states decided to act. South Carolina led the way, seceding from the Union on December 20th, 1860. 4 days later, the news reached William Tecumseh Sherman, superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy. In utter dismay, Sherman poured out his fears for the South. A personal voice, William Tecumseh Sherman. This country will be drenched in blood. The people of the North are not going to let the country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and appliances of war to contend against them? You are rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth, right at your doors. Only in spirit and determination are you prepared for war. In all else, you are totally unprepared. Even Sherman underestimated the depth and intensity of the South's commitment. For many Northern planters, the cry of states' rights meant the complete independence of Southern states from the federal government control. Most white Southerners also feared that an end to their entire way of life was at hand. Many were desperate for one last chance to preserve the slave labor system and saw secession as the only way. Mississippi followed South Carolina's lead and seceded on January 9, 1861. Florida seceded the next day. Within a few weeks, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had also seceded. The shaping of the Confederacy. On February 4, 1861, delegates from the secessionist states met in Montgomery, Alabama, where they formed the Confederacy, or Confederate States of America. The Confederate Constitution closely resembled that of the United States. The most notable difference was that the Confederate Constitution protected and recognized slavery in new territories. The new Constitution also stressed that each state was to be sovereign and independent, a provision that would hamper efforts to unify the South. On February 9th, delegates to the Confederate Constitutional Convention unanimously elected former Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as president and Alexander Stephens of Georgia as vice president. Davis had made his position clear, noting that to present a show of strength to the North, the South should offer no doubtful or divided front. At his inauguration, Davis declared, "The time for compromise has now passed." His listeners responded by singing "Farewell to the Star-Spangled Banner" and "Dixie." The calm before the storm. As the nation awaited Lincoln's inauguration in March, its citizens were confused. What would happen now? 7 slave states had seceded and formed a new nation. 8 slave states remained within the Union. Would they secede as well? President Buchanan was uncertain. He announced that secession was illegal, but that it also would be illegal for him to do anything about it. He tied his own hands, but in truth, there was not much he could have done. One problem was that Washington, D.C. was very much a southern city. There were secessionists in Congress and in all of the departments of the federal government, as well as the president's cabinet. Consequently, mass resignations took place. To some people, it seemed as if the federal government were melting away. One key question remained in everyone's mind. Would the North allow the South to leave the Union without a fight?